Hello, I'm Dr. Stanley Sandler. I'm a historian. I've been in the history business for almost 50 years, teaching in the United States and Canada universities and colleges. Today is September the 2nd, and September 1st is the date, September 1st, 1939, when World War II began. And we can certainly, most historians agree, World War II was the largest man-made catastrophe in the history of the world, okay? About 30 million people, something like that, who's counting, were killed in World War II. One of the things about, we can start at the beginning, okay, would be when did it start? And again, historians debate on it. Historians always debate. I mean, that's how we make a living. But some would say, and they're not entirely wrong, that it actually began in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria. Now, you can say, why would they invade Manchuria? And you're right. I mean, China had no designs on India, on Japan. I mean, Japan just wanted to be left alone, and the Japanese were infringing on their commerce and so on. So the Japanese said our population is increasing fast, faster than our food supply. So Manchuria's got a lot of soybeans, so we'll just take Manchuria. And the League of Nations said, oh, you can't do that. I mean, you can't invade another person's country. And the Japanese just said, well, we're going to walk out. They walked out. And the League of Nations didn't do anything. So you could say that's the start of World War II, but also it revealed the weakness of the League of Nations, which means that of course, like Hitler and the Japanese, could just go ahead knowing that probably there would be no consequences for them. Now, most of the talking about the beginning of World War II does, of course, concentrate on Hitler himself. Hitler came to power in January 1933, the same month as, same year as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in, although the two never met. And Hitler was determined to, and this is what he emphasized more than down with the Jews and so on. He emphasized we've got to crush the Versailles Treaty. This was unfair, it was cruel to Germany. And I don't think they really did Germany that bad. I mean, they didn't take that much, the Allies didn't take that much territory away from Germany. But it was rather humiliating that they couldn't have an air force, they couldn't have a large army. And so they're saying, here we are, poor little Germany, weak, and here's powerful Poland on our eastern front. And so Hitler had a lot of traction by saying, down with Versailles. And so he started to, one of the first things to do, of course, get Germany out of the Depression. I mean, it said before that Depression is an easy act to follow. So he starts putting people to work fairly soon, as well as putting them in concentration camps. So Germany could say, well, we've got out of the Depression. Same thing as Soviet Union would say, there's no unemployment in the Soviet Union. If you're not working in the Soviet Union, we'll put you to work. So the two dictatorships, unlike you decadent democracies, we're moving along here, putting the Depression behind us. Then Hitler in 35 said we got an air force, and the League of the Allies, the British and the French said, well, gee, that's okay, you're violating the Treaty of Versailles. It's a treaty, they signed it under duress, admittedly, but they did nothing about it. So Hitler said, you see. Then he moved into the Rhineland, which is German territory, but Versailles said you can't fortify, can't have troops in the Rhineland. So he moved troops in, and again, nothing happened. Then I'm just kind of doing this rapidly to get into the war, but you have to know some of the background to it. And many, of course, do, just kind of going over it lightly. And then he moved his troops into Austria. The Versailles Treaty said, no way can Austria and Germany be united. And Hitler said, look, the Austrians are all Germans anyway. And I'm a German. I mean, I'm an Austrian. So the German army moved into Austria to the cheers of most of the Austrians, except the Jews, of course, and they were in for a really rough time because the Gestapo apparatus came to Vienna and other places in Austria. Then later in 1938, he suddenly becomes aware that there are a lot of Germans in Czechoslovakia, especially the southern part. They're called Southern Germans or Sudetendeutsch. These poor people are being brutalized by those terrible Czechs who are, of course, biologically inferior anyway. And so he browbeat the British and French to sign a treaty that the Sudetenland would be given to Germany. And then he said, this is my last territorial demand in Europe. In fact, as many of us know, of course, he came back flying, carrying a paper that had this scroll, a piece of paper signed by Hitler and Chamberlain saying, we will never do our best never to go to war again. And it's one of the saddest moments in British history. They cheered, they screamed, they sobbed in the parliament when Chamberlain reported back that I have, Hitler, I have this treaty from Hitler, this piece of paper from Hitler, and it means, and he said, peace in our time. And I mean, the British Empire went into convulsions of hysterical gratitude. Then something comes the dawn, if you will. Hitler then moves into what was left of Czechoslovakia. And the British and French said, but you said you wouldn't. And Hitler basically said nothing. So all of Czechoslovakia is gone. Now, this is, people don't realize Czechoslovakia was the only democracy in that part of the world. It had major industries. They could make their own tanks, okay, and not to mention airplanes and so on. And they couldn't have defeated the Germans or stopped them. They certainly could have given them a hard time. All that was gone, okay. And then, so then finally the British front said, well, you can't exactly trust Hitler. So what's the next country? Well, what's the next country? Hitler's going, oh, the Germans in Poland are being abused by these horrible Poles. So they figured we better give a guarantee, this time mean it, a guarantee to Poland that if Germany invades Poland, we will go to war. And Hitler said, huh, yeah, right, you've said that before about Czechoslovakia. And as a matter of fact, as he's planning for war against Poland, a lot of German officers, high-ranking officers who had access to Hitler, saying, oh, "My Führer, the British and French might come in, and this wouldn't be good. I mean, the French army's big, I mean, they'll give us a hard time." He said, "Look," and this exact quote. He said, "I have seen their leaders at Munich. They are worms." And he wasn't too far off. Okay, I mean, generally, certainly the worst prime minister England ever had. I'm sure most historians wouldn't disagree with that. So he does um, invade Poland. He makes an excuse. There's disorder. They're always restoring order. Hitler never declared war. He's always restoring order. And actually, he had some concentration camp victims dressed in Polish army uniforms shot and laid around a German radio station on the border of Poland, and they broadcast, oh, down with Germany and so on, and say, well, they just, the Poles can't even control their own country. So they moved in September 1st, 1931. The German army blitzkrieg moved into Poland, and wrapped up the Polish thing in about a little more than 5 weeks. So there are myths about the Polish all about the world, lots of myths. And one of the myths is that the Polish Air Force was caught on the ground. And that's not true. Now, the Polish Air Force had some backward planes. I'll give you a picture, an example of one. This is a Polish, let me see if I get it in the thing here. Yeah. This is a Polish airplane from 1939. You can see open cockpit, fixed landing gear, but they shot down a third of the invading German aircraft. They weren't caught on the ground. They saw that the way things are going, so they moved to forests because these go take off from a sod landing field or into Romania. And so the Poles, they weren't caught on the ground. However, the Polish army was wrapped up. They kind of decided we'll defend every square inch of Polish territory. The Germans just moved around with blitzkrieg tanks controlled by aircraft, and then Poland was defeated. And so, and on the 3rd of September, the British and French said either get out of Poland by the 3rd of September or and they did not. And to a lot of people's amazement, a lot of Germans' amazement, including a lot of staff officers, the British and French did declare war on Germany because of the invasion of Poland. And here's what everybody thought and began to work, oh, this is it. Clouds of bombers will appear over London and over Berlin, perhaps, and so on, Paris, dropping gas bombs. We're going to die by the hundreds of thousands because this is what the flyboys were saying before the war: victory through air power. We don't even need armies anymore, really. Just these bombers with poison gas bombs, and they'll drop, and then it's kind of all over. So that's one of the reasons why it's such a strong pacifist movement in the 1930s. They didn't want those kind of horrors, understandably. So, but that didn't happen. What happened between September of 1939 and May of 1940 was what they call the Sitzkrieg, and the Blitzkrieg, the Sitzkrieg, or the Boer War, Bore War. And some historians have pointed out the German army's fighting in Poland here, and they got their work cut out for them. And most of the troops are in Poland. Why couldn't the French and some of the British who were coming over move into eastern Western Germany? They did not. There was a few bombardments, but almost no casualties. And they sat there, I say, from September until May, basically doing nothing. Now I mean, the British were building lots of aircraft, and I'm sure, and drafting people. I had conscription for the first time, peacetime conscription in Great Britain. We get that tradition for them also in the United States. We don't like conscripting in a draft, okay? And I'm sure the French were building up too. And it should be remembered, the French were inferior in the air, but in the ground on their armor, they were pretty good. But anyway, so both sides, they're not doing any combat though, because they we'll go to combat with all this poison gas and whatever. And they're anticipating a World War I type of war. And that, of course, is what the French, particularly the French generals, who were all retreads from the First World War, were anticipating that we'll just have, long, solid battle lines, very little movement. And that is exactly what the Germans had planned too. Oh, Blitzkrieg, well, not here. The German general staff had drawn up a conventional World War I type of plan that will just go rolling over our tanks along the lines to support the infantry, whatever. Well, this plan was, this is the things of history that no one could anticipate. Those plans were being carried from point A to point B in Germany, I'm not sure what, in a courier plane, which actually was not, the pilot was not an official courier. And he didn't know where he was going. And he ran out and came down in Holland. He said, oh no, this is it, I'm dead. So he tried to burn the plan, but the Dutch border people, they lived right on the Dutch-German border, realized what was going on, and they stamped out the fire pretty much. So much of the plan survived. And I guess the officer was sent back to Germany and shot. I mean, I don't know. But now Hitler said, well, that plan has that been compromised, and that the Germans, the French, the big French army, they don't know what we're up to. And so he said, I want another plan. And so General Guderian, Heinz Guderian, Hurricane Heinz, he said, my Fuhrer, I got a better idea than this. Let's use the Blitzkrieg. That is, well, which we kind of did in Poland, and we were pretty successful there. We'll have an armored wedge. We'll have an armored wedge of tanks going through the enemy, and then to find a weak spot, then branching out, but avoiding where there are large concentrations of enemies. So how do you know that? Air power. And all the German tanks were fitted. So the aircraft could say, well, there's a pillbox over here, there's a collection of troops over there, and they knew where to attack. And so Hitler, that sounded kind of, he liked that sort of the blow, the Schlacht, and he liked that. And so they planned for that invasion. And now this was kind of like the invasion of World War I, the Schlieffen plan, where you have to go through Belgium. The poor Belgians, they're invaded in World War I for no reason. I mean, Belgium was friendly with Germany. And then in World War II, the Belgians were so neutral, they had a treaty with Britain and France, and they denounced it. They said, oh, no, that's not neutral enough. And if we do that, then Hitler won't, he won't do anything. Well, he just glommed right through the Belgians. They put up somewhat of a resistance, but of course, the Belgian army against the German army. Well, before they went through Holland, too, by the way. And they pretty well glommed through Holland and then through Belgium. And then they moved, they fought against the Channel, where the British Expeditionary Force was dug in against. See, the British are going to, they thought the Germans will go through Belgium and we'll send our troops forward to stop them. However, the main German thrust was to the south around the Ardennes forest. Now, all the experts say the Ardennes is impassable. It's heavy forest. You can't get through it. And the Germans said, well, there have these winding roads and so on that could take tanks. And I don't know what happened to French air reconnaissance, but they didn't spot them. So the main thrust of the German army was coming through the south central part of Luxembourg, and they go Luxembourg, of course, and then through northern France. And then they were caught as the German army got across the Meuse River. The French were caught flat-footed. Meanwhile, the British are up there, defending Belgium and then pulling back, and they were up against the ocean or the sea, the Channel, at the town of Dunkirk. And there were a lot of French soldiers involved in that too. So French and British soldiers, they said, that's it, 300,000 of them. That's it. Well, this was the miracle of Dunkirk. There are two kind of miracles. For one thing, Hitler apparently, and there's some debate amongst historians, but they pretty well accept that Hitler said, don't attack yet at Dunkirk. It's marshy ground, and I fought in that area during the Great War, and just pull back and refit and everything. So the Germans did. When Hitler says fall back, or they do it. And so in the meantime, though, the British were mobilizing their sea power as much as possible, and the famous small boats. They said that anybody likes to mess around in boats, send your ship over, yachts and whatever, stockbrokers and their yachts and whatever, cross the Channel to Dunkirk, and got off. I believe every single British soldier who was alive and well, wasn't straight. The Germans were strafing the beach, of course, but who survived that got off. Nobody was just actually left behind. Now, I can't prove that, but if they were, the numbers were infinitesimal. So they got off, the French and the British. Now, the French were given the option, you can stay here and continue the war or go home with your families. And a fair number of French soldiers did opt to go back to France. But anyway, although the miracle of Dunkirk, all these troops got back, a new heart for the war, all their equipment was left behind. And I point out, that not a single horse-drawn vehicle was left behind at Dunkirk. The British were completely mechanized, and our modern, they were up to date. Okay, we tend to think, well, they were backward, whatever. They were fighting the First World War. No, they weren't. But all that equipment, you look at the photographs the Germans had taken of Dunkirk, the remnants, what happened after, and it's all full of trucks and cars and vehicles and armored vehicles and whatever. But they had to leave all that behind, and so England had about, I think, one equivalent one division that could stand up to the Germans, as opposed to the Germans like 95 divisions. So that was and I should also point out that just the kind of coincidences in history was that on May 10th, that was the month that the Germans crashed through Holland and Belgium and then northern France, was the day that Chamberlain was voted out of office in the Parliament, and both Chamberlain and Churchill went to King George, and King George had to make that choice, and of course he had to consider how popular they were. And he apparently offered the premiership to Lord Halifax, who was an appeaser. Hitler's not that bad. And Halifax, and I can't really run this country from the House of Lords, so he went to Churchill, who was an aristocrat, but not only wasn't Lord Churchill. So Churchill comes to power, and of course the whole British complexion changes then, because this is when Churchill says, "We'll fight them on the beaches, we shall fight them in the towns, we shall never surrender." And that gave real heart to the British and to the Americans, because a big debate in this country, we're not in the war, but a lot of people say, look, if Britain falls, we're in bad shape. And I don't know if the Germans actually invade us, but it's going to look pretty bad. And a lot of Americans said, look, there's 2,000 miles between us and Europe. So, we like them. We wish them the best, but that's too bad. Big debate. And the election of 1940 centered around that. I mean, people were having fisticuffs and so on over this argument. And Charles Lindbergh was saying, we've got to protect the Aryan race, and the Germans are Aryan, and we got all those, Mongoloid communists to the east, and we don't want to get involved with Germany. We should build up our own defenses, of course, but let's not get out on a limb for Britain. And then our ambassador, Joseph Kennedy Sr., of course, the father of the Kennedy tribe, was saying England is finished. They hated him. When I was in England 20 years after the war, they hated Joe Chamberlain. It was yellow. As soon as the bombing started, he took off from London. I don't know about all that, but he certainly said democracy is finished, England is finished. And Roosevelt had him recalled and said, he said, you're finished. And he said, I don't care what he said to other people. I don't care what you say. As far as I'm concerned, Joe Kennedy is a fascist. All right. So there you have now England. The French have won this great triumph. I mean, the Germans have won this great triumph. And it's not that foreordained. The French had a number of good tanks, the Char B and Renault tanks, which were among the best in the world. The one thing they didn't have that was radio in their tanks. And so they were just kind of going, whereas people on the ground said, go over here, go over there. So they missed a lot of this. But General de Gaulle was in command of the first Légion Blindée, the French first armored division, and he defeated the Germans at the Battle of Montcornet, but that was just one battle. But under good leadership, even without the radio, they could maybe maybe not defeat the Germans, at least stop them. And the British had a good tank too, called the Matilda. That's what they called it. Now I'm going to show a picture of the Matilda here. I mean, a model of the Matilda. I love to make models, and here's a Matilda. There you go. That's the Matilda. It was a slow infantry tank, but how much do we continue to ship arms to England? And that's a whole election, 1940, really basically was centered around that. And we had a draft. Our first draft, 1940, was for 1 year, and to show how strong the isolationism was in America, that it was passed of Romania's 4 divisions. Again, we don't help the British that much. And now Roosevelt's reelection showed that the dominant feeling was to help Britain, because that's what Britain really needed in wartime, like grain especially, but also pit props. Everything in England basically ran by coal, and coal mines need wooden pit props to keep the seams up or the tunnels up. And Britain had pretty well chopped down all this forest. So important, all the woods in Canada and the woods in the United States were being shipped over to England. Not that, also petroleum and whatever, you name it, we were shipping it over to them. And with Roosevelt's reelection in November 1940, that was able to go on. But and our convoys, the American, Canadians, whatever, the Allied convoys, were attacked by the Germans, and one American destroyer was damaged with loss of life, and another one was sunk, the Reuben James. And so maybe this is it. This is